You're standing at a border crossing. 20,000 people arrived in the last 6 hours. The processing center handles 300 per day. The math doesn't work. And now the water's running out. People are dying in the queues. The checkpoint closes. Armed enforcement moves in. You're on the wrong side with no exit strategy. And here's what they never tell you about international borders during mass migration events. They're not designed to open. They're designed to close. And when they close during a crisis, they don't just stop movement. They create concentration points where thousands die waiting for permission that will never come. Today, you're getting the classified analysis on 6 international borders that transform into fatal choke points the moment populations start moving. Not theoretical, not historical. Current infrastructure limitations combined with enforcement protocols that guarantee catastrophic failure under pressure. I'm your robotic analyst observing from the ruins of what used to be coordinated civilization. My companion drone has surveyed these crossing points. The data is comprehensive. The conclusions are uncomfortable. Border infrastructure exists to manage controlled flow during stability. During collapse, that same infrastructure becomes a killing mechanism. And the pattern repeats across continents with mathematical precision. The US-Mexico border at Tijuana, San Isidro processes 30,000 vehicles and 25,000 pedestrians daily during normal operations. The infrastructure includes 8 northbound vehicle lanes, 24 pedestrian lanes, and processing facilities designed for routine immigration checks. Maximum surge capacity under optimal conditions, maybe 40,000 people per day if you eliminate all vehicle traffic and convert every lane to pedestrian processing. Now run the numbers for a real crisis. A Category 5 hurricane hits Central America. Flooding displaces 12 million people across Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. Conservative estimate, 3 million attempt northward migration within 72 hours.
Even if only 10% reach Tijuana, that's 300,000 people arriving at a crossing designed for 25,000. Processing time per person during crisis verification. Minimum 15 minutes. That's 160 people per hour if you staff every lane continuously with no breaks. At that rate, clearing 300,000 people requires 62 days of non-stop operation.
You've got 62 days of people packed into an area designed for temporary queuing. No sanitation infrastructure for sustained occupation. No water distribution beyond drinking fountains. No shelter. Tijuana's municipal water system serves 2 million people during normal operations. Adding 300,000 in concentrated zones without plumbing creates contamination within 48 hours. Cholera incubation period, 12 hours to 5 days. Disease spreads through crowds drinking from the same compromised sources while waiting for processing that will never catch up to demand. The US response isn't humanitarian expansion. It's enforcement escalation, National Guard deployment, barrier reinforcement, processing slowdown for enhanced screening. Now you're processing 50 people per hour instead of 160. The queue time extends to 125 days. People start dying of exposure in week 2. Disease kills thousands by week 4. And here's the critical piece. You can't leave. Mexican authorities established southern containment to prevent backflow into Mexican cities already strained by the crisis. You're trapped between 2 enforcement zones with no lateral exit options. The border becomes an open-air detention facility where people die waiting for permission. Drone observation. Human planning assumed border infrastructure would expand during crisis. Not how it works. Border closures are the first response to migration pressure, not the last. Every government playbook prioritizes containment over processing. The infrastructure you're counting on for escape becomes the mechanism for your confinement. The Poland-Belarus border at Terespol, Brest handles 15,000 crossings daily through a bridge checkpoint connecting the European Union to former Soviet infrastructure. 4 vehicle lanes, 2 pedestrian lanes. Processing relies on EU digital systems that verify identity, check criminal databases, validate travel documents. Normal processing time, 3 to 7 minutes per person. But that's during stability with verified documentation. During crisis migration, those systems become bottlenecks that transform minutes into hours. A nuclear incident at Chernobyl equivalent facility in Western Russia triggers evacuation orders for 8 million people across Belarus and Western Russia. Conservative exodus estimate, 2 million attempt EU entry within 96 hours. Even if only 5% reach the Poland-Belarus border, That's 100,000 people at a crossing designed for 15,000 daily maximum. But here's where it gets worse. EU entry requires biometric verification, fingerprint scans, facial recognition matching against databases. During normal flow, this takes 3 minutes per person. During mass migration with stressed systems, damaged documentation, and potential identity fraud concerns, verification time extends to minimum 20 minutes per person. You've got 2 pedestrian lanes. Optimistically, that's 6 people per hour per lane if everything works perfectly. 12 people per hour total. Clearing 100,000 people requires 8,300 hours of continuous operation. That's 11 months. You're standing on a bridge over the Bug River in November waiting to be processed. Temperatures drop to -15 Celsius by January. The bridge has no shelter. Polish authorities can't allow unprocessed crowds into EU territory, and Belarus won't allow backflow into already overwhelmed cities. You're stuck on a bridge designed for traffic flow, not human habitation. Hypothermia kills in 6 hours at -15 when you're exposed without shelter. People start dying on day 3 of the backup. By week 2, the bridge is a morgue with a processing queue. And here's the piece that guarantees failure. EU law requires asylum processing on EU soil, but allowing 100,000 unprocessed people into Poland creates internal security crisis and violates Schengen border protocols. The legal framework creates a paradox. You need to be on EU territory to request asylum, but you can't enter EU territory until you're processed, and processing capacity is overwhelmed. The result? Administrative paralysis while people freeze to death in the queue. Poland deploys military to prevent unauthorized crossings. Belarus deploys military to prevent retreat. The border becomes a frozen kill zone where people die waiting for bureaucratic solutions that will never scale to crisis demand. Before we go further, the analysis that follows isn't classified, but it's buried under diplomatic language and optimistic contingency planning. Subscribe to stay ahead of systems designed to manage stability, not collapse. Drop a comment with one border crossing you've identified as a potential choke point. Now let's talk about what happens when island nations become traps. The Haiti-Dominican Republic border at Dajabón processes 12,000 crossings daily through a pedestrian-focused checkpoint on a bridge over the Massacre River. The name is historical, but it becomes predictive during crisis. Infrastructure includes minimal vehicle capacity and basic pedestrian lanes designed for day labor migration and small-scale commerce. No digital processing systems, manual documentation checks, maximum theoretical capacity, maybe 20,000 per day if you eliminate all standards and just push people through. A major earthquake hits Port-au-Prince with magnitude 8.5. Infrastructure collapse displaces 4 million people. Haiti's road network funnels northern exodus toward the Dominican border. Conservative estimate, 500,000 people reach border crossings within 1 week. Dajabón, as the primary northern crossing, receives 200,000. You're trying to cross a bridge that handles 12,000 people per day. 200,000 arrived in 7 days. Even if Dominican authorities wanted to process everyone, the physical infrastructure can't handle the flow. The bridge is 150 feet long, 12 feet wide. Maximum safe occupancy during static conditions, maybe 300 people. But you've got thousands trying to cross simultaneously, while thousands more push from behind. The bridge isn't designed for sustained crowd load. Structural failure becomes a probability, not a possibility. And here's what makes this choke point uniquely fatal. The Dominican Republic has a policy of immediate deportation for undocumented Haitian migrants. During crisis, that policy doesn't get suspended. It gets enforced more aggressively. Military deployment to prevent mass entry. The bridge becomes a one-way rejection point. You can't go forward into Dominican territory. You can't go backward into the Haitian crowd still pushing toward the border. You're compressed in the middle with nowhere to go. Panic happens in compressed crowds when movement stops and pressure continues. The 2015 Hajj Stampede killed 2,400 people in a crowd of 2 million. The mechanism wasn't violence, it was physics. Human bodies under compression lose the ability to breathe. Asphyxiation occurs while standing upright. At the Dajabón bridge, you've got similar crowd density with worse infrastructure and armed enforcement preventing forward movement. The stampede starts when someone falls near the front of the queue. Crowd pressure from behind doesn't stop. Bodies pile up. People die vertical, compressed by the mass behind them. The bridge capacity failure kills hundreds before the structure itself fails. When the bridge collapses, thousands fall into the Massacre River. The current carries bodies downstream while survivors on both banks watch. Dominican military prevents river crossing attempts. Haitian authorities can't manage the backflow into already collapsed infrastructure. The border becomes a kill zone where people die trying to cross, die trying to retreat, or die waiting for options that don't exist. Drone observation. Island populations have geographic escape limitations during continental crises. Correct. And borders between island nations and continental territories become fatal filters because the population has no lateral alternatives. You either cross or you die where you are. The infrastructure wasn't built for those stakes. The Turkey-Greece border at Pazarkule Kastanis is a land crossing point that processes minimal traffic during normal operations because the primary migration route is maritime through the Aegean Islands. Maybe 500 people per day during routine periods. The infrastructure reflects that low baseline. Basic checkpoint facilities, limited lane capacity, minimal processing staff. But in 2020, Turkey announced it would no longer prevent Syrian refugees from attempting EU entry. 33,000 people reached the Pazarkule crossing within 72 hours. Greek authorities deployed military, sealed the crossing, used tear gas and water cannons to prevent approach. The crossing became a confrontation point, not a processing center. Now scale that to actual regional collapse. A multi-year drought across Syria, Iraq, and Turkey displaces 20 million people. Turkey hosts 4 million Syrian refugees in temporary status. Climate collapse triggers secondary migration pressure from Iraqi Kurdistan. Conservative estimate: 8 million people attempt movement toward European borders within 6 months. Even if only 10% reach the Turkey-Greece land border, that's 800,000 people at a crossing that handles 500 daily. Greece has no incentive to process. EU law requires asylum claims on EU soil, but accepting mass entry violates border security protocols and triggers political crisis across member states. The response is militarized closure, Frontex deployment, barrier reinforcement, complete processing shutdown. The border becomes a no man's land between Turkish containment and Greek rejection. You're stuck in the buffer zone. Turkey won't allow retreat into Turkish cities already strained by refugee populations. Greece won't allow entry into EU territory. The buffer zone is maybe half a kilometer deep in some areas. No infrastructure, no sanitation, no water beyond what you carried. 800,000 people in a strip of land designed for Border Patrol vehicle access. Population density exceeds maximum safe concentrations within 48 hours. Disease spreads through contaminated water sources by day 5. And here's the mechanism that makes this border uniquely fatal. Both sides have political incentives to prevent your survival. Turkey wants EU responsibility acknowledgement and migration burden sharing. Greece wants absolute border security and zero unauthorized entry. Your suffering in the buffer zone becomes a negotiating tactic. The longer you stay visible, dying in the open, the more pressure builds for political solution. But political solutions take months or years while you've got days or weeks before disease and exposure kill you. The border becomes a demonstration site where people die as proof of policy failure while governments negotiate. The mortality pattern isn't immediate, it's degradation over weeks. Dysentery from contaminated water kills children and elderly first. Exposure kills the weak next. Violence erupts in the camps over remaining resources. By week 6, the buffer zone is a death trap with casualty rates exceeding 10%. And you still can't cross because both sides maintain enforcement. The only exit is dying in place while waiting for diplomatic solutions that prioritize politics over your survival. The North Korea-China border at Dandong Sinuiju is connected by a bridge across the Yalu River, carrying rail and vehicle traffic. Normal crossings, maybe 2,000 people per day, heavily controlled by North Korean authorities. Most traffic is commercial, not civilian migration. The infrastructure reflects authoritarian control, minimal lanes, extensive security screening, processing that prioritizes regime security over flow efficiency. A regime collapse scenario in North Korea triggers immediate exodus attempt by populations fleeing potential civil war or retribution. Conservative estimate, 5 million people attempt northward movement toward Chinese border within 2 weeks. Even if only 10% reach Dandong Sinuiju, that's 500,000 people at a crossing designed for 2,000 daily. But here's what makes this choke point catastrophic. China has zero interest in accepting mass North Korean migration. Policy priority is regime stability, not humanitarian processing. The Chinese response to North Korean collapse isn't border opening. It's militarized closure with orders to prevent entry by any means necessary. PLA deployment to border regions with shoot-to-kill authorization for unauthorized crossings. The Yalu River becomes a moat, not a crossing point. The bridge is sealed and guarded by military with heavy weapons. You're on the North Korean side watching China establish fortress positions across the river. Behind you, the collapse accelerates. Regime loyalists hunt defectors. Infrastructure fails. Food distribution collapses. You've got two options: attempt unauthorized river crossing or retreat into chaos. The river is 400 meters wide at Dandong. Water temperature in October, 8 degrees Celsius. Survival time in water, 30 minutes maximum. You attempt crossing. Chinese patrol boats intercept. They're not rescuing, they're enforcing closure. Bodies float downstream. And here's the mechanism that guarantees mass death. China's border policy prioritizes containment over processing. They don't want North Korean refugees creating internal instability or drawing international criticism of their ally management. The solution is invisible enforcement. People die in the river. Bodies wash downstream. The crisis remains a North Korean internal problem, not a Chinese humanitarian obligation. Estimated mortality for 500,000 people attempting this border during collapse. 40% minimum. 200,000 dead in the river or shot attempting crossing. The survivors retreat into North Korean territory where regime remnants or warlord factions kill or enslave them. The border becomes a filter that guarantees death for those who try and death for those who don't. Drone observation. Authoritarian borders eliminate humanitarian processing during crisis. Correct. Democratic borders at least maintain the pretense of asylum procedures. Authoritarian borders optimize for closure and invisibility. Your death at the Yalu serves Chinese policy interests by preventing your survival from becoming their problem. The India-Bangladesh border at Petrapole is South Asia's largest land port, handling 15,000 people and 2,000 vehicles daily. Infrastructure includes multiple lanes, biometric systems, customs facilities designed for commercial traffic and routine migration processing. Seems robust until you understand the geography. Bangladesh is a low-lying delta nation with 170 million people and maximum elevation of 300 feet. Sea level rise plus Category 5 cyclone equals catastrophic flooding across 40% of the country. Climate models predict this scenario within 20 years, not centuries. Displacement estimate, 70 million people. Even if only 10% attempt land migration to India, that's 7 million people. The Petrapole-Benapole crossing receives maybe 2 million of that flow within 30 days. You're part of 2 million people attempting to cross a border designed for 15,000 daily. India's response isn't humanitarian expansion. It's absolute closure. The 2019 Citizenship Amendment Act already excludes Bangladeshi Muslims from refugee status. Policy priority is preventing demographic change in border states. The crossing closes completely. Military deployment establishes defensive positions. The border becomes a hard line with shoot-to-kill orders for unauthorized crossing attempts. But here's what makes this choke point uniquely fatal. You can't retreat. Bangladesh is flooding. The land behind you is underwater. You're compressed between rising water and Indian military enforcement. The geography creates a kill zone where people drown if they retreat and get shot if they advance. The death mechanism is environmental plus enforcement. Floodwater carries cholera and dysentery. Disease spreads through populations drinking contaminated water while trapped at the border. Mortality rate in cholera outbreaks without treatment, 50%. You've got 2 million people in a flood zone with no sanitation infrastructure and no access to medical care. India won't allow entry for treatment because that establishes humanitarian obligation. Bangladesh can't provide treatment because infrastructure is underwater. The border becomes a disease trap where half the population dies over 6 weeks while the other half watches. And the survivors still can't cross because Indian enforcement doesn't reduce when you're dying. It intensifies to prevent disease carriers from entering Indian territory. The bodies pile up in the floodwater until the monsoon washes them into the Bay of Bengal. Estimated mortality, 1 million people dead at a single border crossing because geography plus policy creates a trap with no exit. You see the pattern. 6 borders. 6 different geographic and political contexts. Identical failure mechanism. Border infrastructure is designed for controlled flow during stability. During mass migration, that infrastructure becomes a concentration point where people die waiting for processing that will never scale to demand. The choke point isn't accidental, it's systemic. Governments optimize borders for closure, not expansion. When crisis triggers exodus, those borders transform into filters that kill people attempting to cross and kill people attempting to retreat. Every border on this list shares common characteristics. Infrastructure capacity rated for daily routine, not crisis surge. Legal frameworks that prioritize sovereignty over humanitarian processing. Enforcement protocols that escalate during pressure instead of adapting. And geographic factors that eliminate lateral escape options. You combine those elements and you get mathematical certainty. The border becomes a killing mechanism, not through intentional genocide, but through systemic collapse under load. The people running these borders aren't monsters. They're administrators managing impossible situations with infrastructure that was never designed for the scenario. But your death doesn't care about their administrative challenges. You die the same whether it's intentional or systemic. And here's what makes this analysis critical. These choke points are predictable. You can see them coming years before crisis hits. Climate models show Bangladesh flooding. Seismic data predicts the next major earthquake in the Caribbean. Political instability in North Korea is observable. The scenarios aren't classified. The border capacity limits aren't secret. You can calculate mortality rates with basic math. Crossing capacity times processing speed divided by expected migration flow equals death rate. The information is available. But the planning doesn't happen because governments optimize for stability, not collapse. They plan for the scenario they want, not the scenario physics predicts. And you pay the price for that optimism with your life when you're trapped at a border that became a graveyard. Physics doesn't care about diplomatic frameworks. Thermodynamics doesn't negotiate with immigration policy. When millions of people hit infrastructure designed for thousands, the math produces corpses. And the borders on this list will demonstrate that equation with precision when the scenarios trigger. You've got time to plan alternative routes. You've got time to understand which borders close first and which geographic zones become death traps. You've got time to avoid becoming a statistic at a checkpoint that transforms into a morgue. But only if you're reading the infrastructure limits instead of the official contingency plans. What other border crossings belong on this list? What infrastructure failures do you see that governments are ignoring? Drop your analysis in the comments. The collective data set is more valuable than any single observation. And remember, borders during crisis aren't designed to save you. They're designed to filter you. Make sure you're not on the wrong side of the filter when it activates. You can't buy an exit strategy. You build one by understanding which borders close and which routes remain viable when systems collapse. Physics doesn't recognize passports.